All right, let's discuss the situation in the Strait with our guests now. Joining me back in the studio is Paul Musgrave, an Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. And down the line from Tehran, Hamid Reza Gholamzadeh joining us from Diplo House, a think tank. Thank you both. Paul, I'll start with you. Iranian TV has been reporting that it's been talking to European countries about a plan for passage in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, no countries have been named, but I'm wondering, do you think even mentioning this sorts of discussion is an attempt to project that Iran is now going around the US, negotiating separately with any other party it needs to, and that will therefore avoid having to negotiate with the US?
I think that this is exactly the right way to think about this. You can look at both Washington and Tehran right now trying to change the strategic dialogue, trying to show that they both have options beyond the stalemate in the Strait of Hormuz. And certainly if you're Iran and your goal is to make sure that you have control over traffic in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, you'd want to display ways that you were trying to make that internationally legitimate, just as Washington is trying to use its summit with Xi Jinping, with China, in order to close off Iran's options at home.
Which maybe did or didn't happen because there wasn't a lot of discussion that came out, Hamid, from that meeting of China and the US about what was happening in the Strait. And so, therefore, do you also agree that this is Iran attempting to avoid further negotiation and to just get back to business with the rest of the world?
You know, the mindset here in Iran is that Iran does not need permission from the Americans or to need to discuss it in the negotiations to have the new regime in Strait of Hormuz. Iran, the argument is that Iran has the right to control its territorial waters, and it is setting up a new framework for that. So about the routes to pass through, about the insurance, about the arrangements, coordination, everything is being defined by this new framework. And Iran is trying to implement that. Yes, of course, it needs further on to have acceptance or approval from other countries, and these can happen in practice. So one of the European countries that has been named in Iranian state media is France. President Macron, within a phone call, has talked to President Pezeshkian and has said that it is working with Iran in order to be allowed to use the passage, and it is accepting the framework. And there are other countries as well, so it is one of the names. But the story is that every country is thinking that the longer this story is going on and the longer this uncertainty is in place in this part of the world, it would be more damaging to them. And all the countries are running out of strategic reserves of oil reserves, and they need to take some action for that. So every single country, despite all the rhetorics that are in place across the world, they are coming to Iran saying that, okay, we want to have some vessels go through, and what are the conditions, and let's work together. And that is the way it is working right now. So it is a reality on the ground. The negotiations aside, possible military attacks aside, countries are working now to have some vessels gone through so that they can actually compensate the shortages of the energy and the oil and such things. And then they are working with Iran in that regard. So that is the practical aspects of the current situation, as was mentioned.
Paul, there's clearly some short-term pressure on economies, both local to the region and broader than that, to try and ease the pressure of the transit there. But is this a strategy that will work long-term? And when I say work, I mean that other countries will accept. It almost sounds like they're being held hostage to there is no other choice.
I think that's exactly right. You know, back in medieval times, there was a very useful phrase, highwaymen, people who would waylay travelers on the King's Road and force them to, pay protection money to move through their territory. And what Iran is proposing, despite all of the legal framework that people have discussed, is exactly this. Now, whatever Iran's position is on this, it's quite clear that this assertion violates the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's a coincidence that both major combatants have, of course, refused to accept this.
The US isn't bound by it either.
But the United States isn't bound by it, but it has always said that it would abide by it. And there's a big difference there. And the U.S. has, in fact, largely abided by that. But the rest of the world has an interest not only in Hormuz, but with every other choke point around the world. And if Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, Yemen, you name it, is allowed to put the same kind of pressure on. Imagine Spain making the same declaration about passage in and out of the Mediterranean. This would be a very dangerous precedent. And so that's where I think that the long-term question about legitimacy and about whether Iran can actually sustain this is really important, because it's not just a question of how much pain Iran can endure, it's also a question of the pain that Iran is inflicting. And by using this sort of pain as a leverage, it's crude, it's effective, but in the long term, it's not exactly legitimate.
Hamid, can I get your thoughts on that? It was particularly with Paul's point that this is inflicting pain, and I'm wondering how you imagine your Gulf neighbours will be feeling about this, because they are effectively being impacted by this. It is costing their economies now, and to get things back to business, it will cost their economies in the future.
Despite all the major parts of the remarks by the distinguished guest at the studio that I would agree, but when it comes to legitimacy, I would like to disagree. It could be some sort of double standards. If you have international law, so you are supposed to follow that under any circumstances, and that is the meaning of the law. So if the settings that we have had is not working now, or is something that we don't like it, or it would not favor our interests, doesn't mean that it is illegal. So Iran and the United States and UAE, for example, are not signatories to the Law of Seas and 1982 law. So they are not under that law to have these parts of water as international waters. For other countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, if they are signatories, they are supposed to follow the rules. If they are not, or Spain or anywhere else, if they are not part of that treaty, they are not supposed to do that, and they can ask for some governance over their waters. But if they are, it's another story. So that is what law tells us, and that is the legal procedures that usually happens. Regarding the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, as you mentioned, Iran has said that the most important point for Iran is hostility. So if they continue to be hostile, they are not allowed to pass through that. And that's the point about international law. Security overrides everything else. So if the security of the country is damaged, it can stop everything to protect its own country. So if UAE, for example, continues to attack Iran or to support the Israelis or the Americans and to act hostile against Iran, so Iran would not allow even the trade vessels to go through. But the other countries, any other countries, even UAE, if they stop hostility, they would be allowed to go through the Strait of Hormuz, and there would be no threat to Iran. Part of that, in long term, would be the American bases in their countries. So I would say it is my position and my analysis, not an official remark, that the very existence of those military bases in those countries is a threat to Iranian security, and they need to remove them.
Hamid, thank you so much. I'm sorry to end it there. Thank you so much. We've run out of time. Hamid Reza Gholamzadeh joining us from Tehran, and Paul Musgrave joining me in studio. Thank you.